got Monarch of the Month. Where we got to in the last episode was that King Stephen had a few battles with his cousin Matilda, and in the end they agreed that Matilda's son would become king when Stephen died. That's exactly what happened, so we'll start from there.
Monarch of the Month!
So who was the next monarch after King Stephen?
The next monarch after King Stephen was Henry II,
Okay.
who was the grandson of the Conqueror and cousin of Stephen. He was known as Fitz-Empress. Fitz means son of, and Empress because he was the son of Empress Maud, who was Matilda. It was just another word, another name that Matilda had. She was married to the Emperor of France, so she was known as the Empress Maud. So, he's not his nickname, but he was known as Fitz-Empress. But his nickname was Kirkmantle, because of the coat that he wore, or should I say the cape that he wore, which was short. In them days, they normally had a really long cape, but he wore a short one, which was in keeping with the Angevines, and he was the first of the Angevine kings, which basically means that his dad was the Count of Anjou. History records him as the Angevines, Stephen being the last of the Normans.
And we spoke in the last episode about King Stephen and the battles that he had with his cousin Maud, and there was an agreement that Henry II would become Henry II after they had those battles. The
agreement was that Matilda, or the Empress Maud, which one you want to call her, she went back to France on the proviso that when Stephen died, her son would then become the next monarch. So she exiled herself back to France, and of course when Stephen died, Henry II, he became king.
So, did he do anything of note at all during his reign?
Well, he was a strong king, but he was unable to curb the church powers. Do you know what I mean? Because the church was it was so big in them days, do you know what I mean? And I suppose his main claim to fame, when he was young, he was friends with a man called Thomas Becket. Not Thomas A. Becket, Thomas Becket. And they got up to all sorts and did this and did that and did other. And when he became king, he bestowed all sorts of honours on Thomas Becket. And the last one he bestowed on him was the Archbishop of Canterbury. And that's when Thomas Becket suddenly became pious. Because before that he wasn't pious. And he suddenly became pious, and he wouldn't do anything that Henry II wanted him to do, or one thing or another. And the story goes that he was talking one day amongst his knights and his what have you, and in court and what have you, and Thomas Becket had done something against what he'd asked him to do, and he blurted out, "Who will rid me of this troublesome priest?" And the story goes that 3 of his knights went to Canterbury and hacked him to death, hacked Thomas Becket to death. And again, the story goes that he didn't really want them to do that.
They just interpreted
it. And of course, all hell let loose when that happened. And he did a massive penance. He went on a pilgrimage and crawled like miles to Canterbury on his hands and knees, bleeding and one thing and another. When he got to the Canterbury Cathedral, the monks lined up and whipped him, and all the rest of it. So I would have thought that if he'd have wanted it to happen, he wouldn't have let the monks do that. I would have thought, being more or less an absolute monarch, but none of them really were absolute monarchs. If they didn't have the backing of the nobles and the barons and what have you, they get murdered or abdicate or whatever. But he was also the first of the Plantagenets, because his father's crest was a flower that he wore in his cap, and it was a Plantagenet. So it became the Plantagenet. And the Plantagenet dynasty lasted for quite a long time, for hundreds of years, it lasted right up to Richard III. He had 9 children, which 2 became kings. He was married to Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was a very famous queen in her own right. He died and was buried. He died of dysentery. Again, a lot of them died of dysentery. The sad thing about was his two sons, his main two sons, rebelled against him with the King of France. And there were wars and one thing or another and what have you. And that really weakened him and one thing or another. And I suppose you could say in today's terms that he died of a broken heart, I suppose. But he's buried at France, in France. I suppose his main claim to fame is his two historically famous sons that came after him.
And who were they?
Richard I and John. One history recalls that was a great hero, and the other one history recalls he were a baddie. But it wasn't necessarily like that, really, to be in all honesty. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So Richard I was he the first son to follow him?
Richard I was the first son to follow him, and he was the second great grandson of William the Conqueror, and the eldest surviving son of Henry II. He had no children, and he was married to somebody that I've never heard the name really, and I can never say it unless I look at it, and it's Berengaria of Navarre in France, and it must be a province in France somewhere that was quite popular at the time because there's another king that was married to a Joan of Navarre, but Berengaria, it sounds really foreign, that, doesn't it? But he had no children, and of course he was reputed to be gay, but no proof. Again, no proof. But he's remembered in history by his, not by his regnal number, like Richard I. His nickname was Coeur de Lion, which is the Lion Heart. And there were a couple of kings, foreign kings, not English kings, but foreign kings. There were a king of France that had the same name, and another king that had the same name. But Richard the Lionheart, the English Richard the Lionheart, is the most famous of them all. And he was more or less, he was the great British hero, not British really, English hero. And to be perfectly honest with you, he was a bad king. He reigned for 10 years and spent less than a year in England. He didn't speak English. Didn't want to speak English, and he died in battle in France.
So he spent the majority of his time in France then?
He spent the majority of his time he did spend the majority of his time in France, but he spent the majority of his reign fighting the Crusades, fighting the Third Crusade. And that's where, see, the thing is, like I've told you before, the clerics, the scribes, were monks and priests and what have you that wrote. There were very few people that could write. And because he was such a great churchgoer and gave to the church and gave lands to the church, he got a great press. As simple as, do you know what I mean? So he was a wonderful, great bloke, do you know what I mean? And I suppose as far as they were concerned, he was. But the thing is, as far as England were concerned, he really was not a very good king because he wasn't interested. I suppose really, in a way, he became King of England, and the reason he became King of England was to get as much money as he could to go fight his battles. And
he was fighting battles, which I assume where his name came from, Lionheart.
He's Crusader. In the Crusades, he was a very brave warrior, very brave, and it wasn't like in later days when they sat on top of a hill and watched all the men fighting. They were there in the thick of it. They were there fighting hand-to-hand combat, and I mean, you can imagine, can't you, what it was like fighting with great big swords and God knows what. Do you know what I mean?
Not
big
pretty.
No, it's not. And you know, he was a great warrior and a great fighter, but he wasn't particularly good for England. And he had loads of lands, and he was fighting a war against the King of France, the French. On one of his lands, one of his properties, lands in what is now modern day France. I can't remember actually where it was, but a crossbowman shot him in the neck, and he got gangrene in it, and it killed him. But on his deathbed, and this is something to be said about how he was revered as a warrior, he called for the crossbowman to come to his deathbed and pardoned him. Instead of having him executed, he pardoned him.
Interesting.
And because that was a chivalric thing to do. And it was a war, and he took his chances and what have you, and he shouldn't be punished for it. So that way you can say, very English, I suppose.
Well, yeah.
Even though he didn't speak English.
Very polite.
But he were buried with at the same place as his father in Fontervort. But his heart were buried in Rouen.
Just his heart.
Just his heart. Because what he wanted his nobles. He wanted his heart to be buried in the Holy Land, where he'd done all the crusades. But they got waylaid and one thing and another, so they didn't take it to the Holy Land, and he got buried at Rouen. So, and that was sort of that type of thing.
So following him was John. Now, is this John that lost all the crown jewels?
Yeah.
Is this the
John
one?
the Blanca?
Yeah.
Did,
so tell us about that.
Well, John again. He was the second great grandchild of William the Conqueror, and he was the youngest son of Henry II. His nickname was Lackland because when he was born, his father said, "I've no more land to give him," because there were so many. Do you know what I mean? So his name was Lackland, and it stuck with him. He got married twice, both to somebody called Isabella, and he had 5 children, all from his second wife. But unlike his older brother, history's not been so kind to John, because he deserves to be bigged up in a way, because most medieval kings, were cruel, and unlike most medieval kings, he was. But he was the one that was forced to sign the Magna Carta, and that is the cornerstone of our democracy. Now, for all when he did it to placate the nobles, his son reneged on it. Do you know what I mean? But then there was a second one came out, and one thing and another. And another little interesting fact. Great quiz question. This. Where did John sign the Magna Carta? And most people write down at the bottom. Well, he didn't because he couldn't write. It was his seal that he put on the bottom of the Magna Carta. It's not signed King John because he couldn't write, like most kings couldn't write.
No. So that was a fairly significant occurrence, though. If that is what our sort of current laws are based on, he's quite an important king, even though he lost the crown jewels.
Yeah, it is. It's a massive thing when you think about it. Things like to be no imprisonment without trial and all the rest of it, tried by 12 of your peers, all it goes on and on and on and on, and it's all things that are relevant today. And as I say, for all, he reneged on it. And in all fairness as well, when it was first done, it was designed for nobles, it wasn't designed for common folk. But it's come down through history, and it's come to us common folk, if you like. Do you know what I mean? So it's in a way, he did more for England, in a way, in my opinion. He did more for England than Richard did. And he spoke English.
Well, yeah, that's a bonus.
But yeah, he did. He were going away from marching away from somewhere, and he took the crown jewels with him wherever he wanted, the greedy little sod. And he got the tides wrong, and they were going across the Wash, which is the estuary of a river down south, and he got all the tides wrong, and the tide came in, and all the wagons got stuck, and he lost all the crown jewels.
Oh, no.
Yeah. So my nickname for him is not John Lackland, it's John the Plonker.
John the Plonker. Yeah.
Yeah. So
and they were lost completely.
Yeah, they're still. They've been looked for it in modern day. They've looked for it and what have you, but nobody's ever found it. Or if they have, nobody's ever admitted to it and they've cut them up or whatever. But I would imagine that if somebody found them, they'd be priceless. So I wouldn't imagine that they'd cut them up and what have you. But to this day, they're lost, yeah. But they'll have all gone into sediment and mud and one thing. They'd have to dig all the sea bed up, I suppose, to try and get to them. Yeah. When John did something, he did it properly.
Yeah, you can give him that.
Yeah, he did, yeah. And they reckon he died again of dysentery. And they reckon it was brought on after an overindulgence of peaches, believe it or not.
Of peaches?
Which was a very rare fruit for England in them days. And again...
So it was a very exotic fruit.
Another one that died of dysentery.
Yeah.
And he's buried at Worcester Cathedral. And he was the last of the Angevin kings, because he was the last one to hold the title Count of Anjou. And of course, he lost all the territories. He lost them all, and it wasn't until later kings who fought to get some of them back and what have you. But he lost a lot. He really was a plonker.
So he lost the crown jewels, and he lost a lot of land as well.
And he lost a lot of land.
But he signed the Magna Carta, so
well, no,
pretty
he put his
significant.
seal at bottom. You've got to remember that. He put his seal at bottom.
Yeah. Well,
because if you're ever in a quiz and they say to you, where did King John sign the Magna Carta? He didn't. He put his seal at the bottom of it.
Because he couldn't write.
That's right.
So it was a mixed reign, shall we say that?
Yeah. It would always, like most of them, he would always fighting with the rebels. And when I say rebels, the rebel nobles. He always wanted to get more taxes than they were prepared to give. Because you've got to remember in them days, to get taxes, to get a significant amount of taxes, they had to be rich. They had to be the nobles. They got a significant amount of tax from the nobles, and they got fed up of it. And they were always... That's why Parliament... They had Parliament. People tend to think that there were no Parliament until Charles II and Oliver Cromwell. But there were always Parliaments. But they were only there to raise taxes. That's a king
on behalf of the king.
On behalf of the king, and it were mainly to go to war. It were mainly that he'd call a parliament to go to war. And there's another king that I'll tell you about in a while, and he was a bit of a bugger. He'd call for parliament to raise money for wars, and as soon as he got money, he says, "No, we're not going."
Only joking.
I'm only kidding.
Yeah. So, who reigned next, and what year are we in now?
He died in 1272. In 1207 did John. So the next king was his eldest son, another Henry III, and he was the third great grandson of William the Conqueror.
So there you go. Once again, some really interesting stuff. Hope you're enjoying the series.